ดีทุกท่านนะคะวันนี้เรามากันแบบเร่งด่วนมากๆนะคะเพราะว่าเรื่องราวความขัดแย้งระหว่างอิสราเอลกับปาเลสไตน์นะคะวันนี้ก็เลยเชิญคนที่เชี่ยวชาญด้านนี้โดยตรงนะคะเพราะว่าจริงๆเขาเป็นคนเป็นชาวปาเลสไตเนียนนะคะก็คือดร. อาเมด ชานิรานะคะจริงดร. อาเมด ชานิราเนี่ยเคยเรียนอยู่ที่ University Leeds นะคะที่สหราชอาณาจักรอยู่ระยะหนึ่งแล้วก็ย้ายตาม professor ไปนะคะที่มหาวิทยาลัย Coventry นะคะแล้วก็เรียนจบจาก University of Coventry ในปี 2017 นะคะปัจจุบันก็คือกลายเป็น permanent resident แล้วนะคะอยู่ที่อังกฤษนะคะคือไม่ได้อยู่เพียงลำพังคนเดียวนะคะดร. เนี่ยยังเอาภรรยาไปด้วยนะคะแล้วก็มีลูก2คนนะคะก็ตอนนี้กลายเป็น PR นะคะหรือว่า permanent resident ที่สหราชอาณาจักรเรียบร้อยนะแต่ว่าในช่วงชีวิตนึงนะคะก็เคยเกิดและเติบโตมาอยู่ในใกล้ก็คือบริเวณฉนวนกาซาเลยนะคะแล้วก็จริงๆลูกสาวยังทันนะคะลูกสาวที่เกิดเนี่ยยังทันและประสบพบเจอกับเหตุการณ์ที่มีระเบิดลงอะไรแบบนี้คือลูกสาวเนี่ยพอย้ายมาอย่างที่สหราชอาณาจักรเนี่ยถ้าเวลาได้ยินเสียงพลุเลยจะมีความกลัวเหมือนระเบิดนะคะอันนี้ก็เลยเล่าให้ฟังว่าจริงๆก็ค่อนข้างที่จะต้องเรียกได้ว่าเป็นคนที่อยู่ในสถานการณ์จริงๆนะคะวันนี้ท่านก็จะมาเล่าเรื่องราวให้เราฟังนะคะอาจจะเลทนิดนึงเราบอกว่าอาจจะเกินชั่วโมงนะคะโอเค please welcome Dr. Ahmed Tannira.
Hi everyone. I'll start with introducing myself. I'm pretty sure Chan has done a bit of introduction. I currently work as an independent researcher in a think tank.in Leeds. I recently published a book called Foreign Aid to the Gulf Strip, an instrument for trusteeship and the development. I don't know how much you know about the history of the Palestinian and Israeli conflict. It's probably one of the most extended conflicts in modern history, and probably the most complicated for the fact it's partly a sectarian conflict that is based on religious ideology, but also it's a conflict that involves too many parties at the international level, the U.S. in first instance, and probably a few other European countries who are either backing one side or the other. I'll start by giving a bit of introduction about this conflict, but then we need to focus more on what's happening now. Why is it happening, and why now? As a matter of fact, there wasn't such a thing called Israel before 1948 or 47. Israel is basically a newborn state, like a state that is 73 years old. But then, how did this happen? And here we can't neglect the colonial history of British Empire back then, and especially in relation to the First World War and the Second World War. The entire Middle East area, including Egypt and all the surrounding countries like Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, the remaining Arab countries were ruled under the British mandate. But then, after the end of the second or the First World War, that area has undergone a process of division. Like the British Empire started drawing borders and basically deciding the border of each country, except for Palestine. Palestine, because of the sensitive and the importance of that spot where Muslims, Christians and Jews claim that they have originated, like Jesus was born in Palestine, in Bethlehem. The sons of Abraham originated or came from that area. So that area was Muslims, the majority of people living in that area were Muslims, and Jews claim that this is the promised land for the Jewish people, and this is what God has promised them. Because of what was happening to the Jewish people in Europe, where almost 95% of the Jewish population were basically concentrated or were living in Europe, and because of the rise of anti-Semitic persecution as a result of the Nazis persecuting the Jewish people, some of these people have immigrated, or the Jewish people have immigrated to the US. Some came to move to different European countries like the UK. But then the greatest majority of them wanted to go to the Middle East because the British Empire back then promised them, according to a Balfour Declaration, a land. The British Empire back then said it's a land for no people. And so basically Palestine, according to the Jewish Empire, was a land that have no people.
ตรงนี้ก็จะเป็นตัวอย่างวิดีโอนะคะที่จะมีคลิปเสียงพูดถึงเรื่องราวของปาเลสไตน์แล้วก็อิสราเอลค่ะ
When were Palestinians born? What was all this area before the First World War? When Britain got the mandate over Palestine, what was Palestine then? Palestine was then the area between the Mediterranean and the Iraqi border.
You say there was no such thing as
East
Palestinian?
and West Bank, no. East and West Bank was Palestine. I'm a Palestinian. From 21 until 48, I carried a Palestinian passport. There was no such thing in this area as Jews and Arabs and Palestinians. There were Jews and Arabs.
This is the first Israeli prime minister saying there wasn't such a thing basically called Israel. It was all Palestine until the British mandate, according to the British mandate, that Israel was formed as a state. But then there was a Jewish population because Palestine has always had a Jewish population, a Christian population, a Palestinian population, regardless of the percentage. And Golda Meir is herself, or was herself, a Palestinian. But then Jewish people from Russia, from Ukraine, from the US, from Germany, from all these ex-Soviet Unions started migrating. But these were not indigenous Jewish population. They were European Jewish population migrating from Europe to Palestine. So like there is in Egypt, for instance, in Egypt, there is a Jewish population. In Yemen, there is a Jewish population. But then the focus is to concentrate all the Jewish people in one country and to establish a Jewish state. And this was meant to happen in Palestine. So if we look at this map, for instance, this is in 1997, the green and yellow. The green represents where the Jewish population were basically were living. So until 1997, there were no Jewish basically cities or towns exclusively for the Jewish people. They were scattered and living across the country. Now, in 1946, the Jewish population started forming their colonies or their settlements, and they started kind of building their towns and cities with the help and support of the British Army back then, as the ruling power in that region. Now, when the State of Israel was formed, according to the United Nations resolution, a state for the Palestinians and a state for the Jewish people. And now Israel started to expanding and confiscating land. So as time has gone by 1949, the Palestinian space has kind of shrunk to a great percentage. As we can see, this is the Gaza Strip and this is the West Bank, and the remaining is Israel. And again, in 1956, that area has even decreased until what we have now. This is how Israel continued to expand at the expense of Palestinians. Now, if we look, someone might ask, what's the population of Israel and what's the population of Palestinians? It's almost the same. Palestinians live in these scattered lands. About 8 million people live in this area, and the remaining area is controlled by Israel. We hear in the news, Gaza Strip. Everybody might think, it must be a massive piece of land or a massive city or governor. No, it's a very tiny place. 2006, 40% of the Gaza Strip was basically Israeli settlements. So even 360,000 square meters, 40% of that land was Israeli settlements until they decided pulled out as a result of the Palestinian resistance. Palestinian resistance were basically military attacks against these settlements until they've decided to pull their settlement out of the Gaza Strip and to relocate them into the West Bank. The West Bank, until the 1967 borders, when Israel basically confiscated the remaining of land, the United Nations issued a resolution that the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza Strip should be exclusively for Palestinians, and this is what's going to be the future Palestinian state. However, Israel did not respect this resolution and continued to basically confiscate more land in the West Bank. So, according to the United Nations, any settlements that are built on the West Bank here, basically, are illegal. However, Israel did not respect and they continued to build. As we can see here, the green is Palestinian areas. But if you can see, they are quite scattered. They're not connected. Why is this? The blue is Israel. So basically, now the West Bank, which is according to the United Nations, it should be entirely for Palestinians, is not. It's almost swallowed into Israel. And if you look at the blue, it's connected. You will find a way to get to one area to another. Meanwhile, the green is kind of spots here and there. Why is this? Because Israel, as of 2012, decided to build what is known as the separation wall in order to basically cut off the Palestinian areas to make them independent cities and towns. How is this possible? I will show you in pictures. This is how it is. So this is Israel and this is Palestine. This is modern. This is basically primitive. This is developed. This is underdeveloped. Can you imagine in any country where the country or the city is divided? So many families ended up having relatives on one side of the border and the other side on one border. Even some houses, literally, a house was split into two parts. This was split. So you might find your brother living in two rooms on the side of the house and you live on the other. This is the reality of the West Bank. And here we see more. Now, the situation in East Jerusalem, according to the international law, it's basically it's the old city. Jerusalem, according to the Quartet Agreement, which is the United Nations, US, Russia, and the Arab League, they have offered a resolution where Palestinians and Israelis accept Jerusalem is a state for two countries. East Jerusalem, which is the old city, belongs to Palestinians because the identity of the city is Muslim. It's where the mosques and the churches are, and the West Jerusalem is for Israelis. However, Israel did not respect this, and the US has supported it in 2019 when they've issued a declaration that Jerusalem is one capital for Israel. And they have moved the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem as an indirect and explicit kind of approval for Israel to confiscate the remaining of the city. If we can play this video, it will tell you the situation, or it will give you an example of what's happening now.
You are stealing my house.
And if I don't steal it, someone else is going to steal it.
No one is allowed to steal it, Ya Ammi. Yaakov, you know this is not your house.
Yes, but if I go, you don't go back. So what's the problem? Why are you yelling at me? I didn't do this.
But
It's easy to yell at me, but I didn't do this.
You are stealing my house.
Right. So basically this is more about what's happening now, about how the current or the current escalation has happened. It's basically started from East Jerusalem in a neighborhood called Sheikh Jarrah, as we saw in the video. Sheikh Jarrah is basically one of the biggest neighborhoods in East Jerusalem. And Israeli settlers continue to basically expel Palestinian families to take their homes. So a family might be waking up in the morning to find a couple of settlers coming armed with guns and basically telling them, okay, we're gonna live on the second floor of your house, or we're gonna take these 2 bedrooms and live in them. And they would not have no paperwork or a proof of ownership or anything, like we have seen in that video. If I don't steal it, another settler will come and steal it. Anyway, someone is going to steal it. I'd rather steal it myself before another settler comes and steal it. That's simple as that. And why would a settler come with all this confidence to your house and tell you, I need to do this and I'm not afraid? Usually when someone is not afraid, they're backed up by the government, by the police, by the army, and they know that they will not be punished for their act. And they're not basically ashamed of. I would be very ashamed to tell someone this. It's insane. But they're not. They consider this as an act of resistance. The settlers consider this as an act of heroism because they want to kick the Palestinians out and they want to claim the land back, because this is a land that was promised to them 2,000 years ago. So what happened, there was an escalation in East Jerusalem where settlers were trying to obtain a number of houses in Sheikh Jarrah during the month of Ramadan. And I'm sure some of you know what's the month of Ramadan. Basically, Muslims are fasting, they're busy, they're weak, they're basically focusing on their worship. So basically, they were coming to them during the day and night and telling them, okay, leave the house. You need to leave the houses. What would this trigger? This would trigger confrontation between settlers who are usually armed and the residents of these houses. But just before I continue, I need to tell you something. Palestinian families in East Jerusalem are not allowed to make any modifications on their houses. They are not allowed to do any maintenance, any renovations, anything. If their house collapses, they're not allowed to repair it until they have an approval from the court, from the Israeli court. And usually like 99% of the time, the Israeli court would reject their applications for renovation. Why is this? Because they want this house to collapse. They want them to leave the house. Because if you live in a house that you know that in any day it will collapse, it will on its own, then you will leave it. And that's basically what they're doing. They're not allowing them to rebuild, to extend, to make extensions, to do anything. So confrontations between armed settlers and Palestinians living in Sheikh Jarrah began, where Palestinians were basically cut off from their homes. They were not allowed to access their homes. They were not allowed to access the mosque in Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. They were imprisoned by hundreds, and tens of them imprisoned, were arrested. Resistance movement to start firing rockets into Jerusalem. Against settlers. How the current cycle of violence started. So basically, it started from Jerusalem, but ended in Gaza. Now the media or Israel is trying to focus, okay, it's a conflict between Gaza and Israel. It's not a conflict between Palestinians and Israel. No, it's a conflict between Hamas as a terrorist organization, as basically classed by the US and by the UK, and because it fires rockets against Israel. Now, this makes us go back and talk about Gaza Strip. Now, we know the situation in Jerusalem. Let's talk a bit about Gaza Strip. What is Gaza Strip? This is Gaza Strip. It's a very tiny bit. Gaza Strip, basically, it's a coastal enclave that is controlled entirely from outside, from the borders, by Israel. So no Palestinians can go out or go in without approval from Israel. There are 3 crossing points to the Gaza Strip. It's like a big prison that has 3 gates. This is one gate, and this is another gate, but this is controlled by Egypt, and it's most of the time closed, basically. Palestinians, although the coastal enclave is located on the Mediterranean Sea, Palestinians are not allowed to fish apart from 6 nautical miles, or many times 3 nautical miles, like at the present time only 3 nautical times. Basically, they can't do any fishing. And there are about 2 million people living in this coastal enclave. It's like a concentration camp. It's very highly condensed. And by the way, I am originally from the Gaza Strip. I lived in the Gaza Strip almost 30 years, for 30 years. So basically 3/4 of my life I lived in that particular area. So what's happening now is that Hamas, which is like the second largest political movement, and it's an armed resistance group, manufactures local rockets, missiles. They're very primitive. We call them stupid rockets. They're not controlled by satellites, and they're not they're rockets. They fly and they hit a building, but there is no chance they would basically make a building collapse. So they fire rockets into Israel, and then Israel finds an excuse to hit Gaza back, killing thousands of civilians living in the Gaza Strip. Last night, the house next to my uncle's house was hit without prior warning, killing about 9 children. So these are kind of personal stories that we hear every now and then in the Gaza Strip. So just a bit of history. Again, when Israel was formed as a state, where did Palestinians go? Because basically millions of Jewish people came into Palestine, and millions of Palestinian people were displaced. Where did they go? For instance, I am a refugee myself. I don't belong to the Gaza Strip. I'm not originally from the Gaza Strip. I am from a different city that is now Israel. So Palestinians, when Israel was formed, were forced or were displaced into Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, basically the surrounding countries. And some of them were internally displaced into cities inside historical Palestine. Like myself, I did not go to Egypt or Jordan. I went to my great-grandfather came into the Gaza Strip, and we started a new life in the Gaza Strip. But I have lived in the Gaza Strip as a refugee, as a second-class citizen. We lived in refugee camps, and until now, 75% of the population living in the Gaza Strip are originally refugees. They're not indigenous Gazans. They're refugees waiting for a solution by the United Nations for them to return back to their original cities and towns. However, Israel rejects this right and tells, okay, no refugees are returning to their lands. We live in special neighborhoods. We like refugee camps. We have our own schools, schools run by the United Nations called Schools for Refugees. We have our own clinics. So we attend to clinics and hospitals designed for refugees and run by the United Nations. In terms of mobility in and out of the Gaza Strip, as I said, the Gaza Strip is entirely controlled, like air, sea, like space, sea, land borders are entirely controlled by Israel, and except for one border, which is borders with Egypt. Until very recently, this border was closed permanently, except for they would open the border for 2 days every 3 months or 2 months to allow people to go out for emergency reasons, like someone who's got cancer, they want to go for mitigation outside of the Gaza Strip, they would travel to Egypt. And they would have to go under security checks to make sure they have no negative records or no security records whatsoever. Recently, Egypt decided to open the borders with Gaza Strip and to allow people to travel. But again, most of the time, the borders with Egypt are closed. So this is briefly the situation in the Gaza Strip. I'm happy to kind of now allow for kind of questions and more kind of interactive discussions.
I heard the bombing at the center building of the Al Jazeera in it.
Right, yes.
Yeah. So I was wondering, are there any symbolic of it? Because obviously Al Jazeera well known in Arab world. So I'm not sure why it has to target it on this particular place or...
What's been happening over the past 6 or 7 days is different. I think Israel is trying to choose, is quite embarrassed by the situation. And as we have seen, the majority of casualties are citizens. And this is something that embarrasses Israel, and maybe when this situation improves, there's going to be legal consequences. So what Israel has been trying to do is trying to do it quick and concise. So it's not only Al Jazeera. Israel has been basically doing some strategic targets. This is including destroying infrastructures, like they have been targeting, for instance, main streets, just bombing the streets, bombing the telecommunication infrastructure, like massive buildings. Why they would hit residential buildings? Like we have seen about 10 residential buildings. Each residential building contains about 100 flats. So you would have, in one target, you would have 100 family displaced in 1 second. Instead of just targeting small houses, they would go for compounds and for buildings. They have targeted power plants, water wells. Yesterday, they have targeted the building that contains many international media, including Al Jazeera. But because Al Jazeera is very influential and very famous, this has probably received more attention than anything else. They want basically to send a message that we want to weaken the message that is coming out of Gaza. And this message is coming through media agencies. So we want to weaken that aspect of letting information coming out of the Gaza Strip. We want less coverage. And let's basically target electricity, let's target communication, and let's target a media agency. So that's why yesterday Al Jazeera and other media agencies were targeted.
This person asks about the role of the United Nations or any other countries, maybe United States of America, maybe the UK, that probably would like to help out to sort of tone down a bit of these conflicts. Are there anything at all that's going to help with the conflicts between Israel and Palestine right now?
Unfortunately, Israel is enjoying an immunity and protection by the U.S. So there were a few attempts last week to basically hold an emergency session in the United Council to discuss the situation in the Gaza Strip and Jerusalem and Israel. However, the U.S. has blocked this attempt and has stopped it from going forward. So, which encourages Israel basically to carry on with what it is doing. The U.S. refuses to condemn. The UK has condemned. Well, it was a very shy condemnation. The European Union has strongly condemned what's happening. But again, condemnation will not change any facts on the ground unless there is a decision by the United Nations Security Council. Then Israel will not abide by any laws or any resolutions. But every time a group of countries within the United Nations or General Assembly or Council, Security Council try, like France called for it, UK called for it, China has called for it, Russia has called for it, but then it was blocked by the US. So it failed to move forward or to go forward. So, and that's why we always say that Israel enjoys an immunity given by the US. As for the role of the United Nations on the ground, in many instances, the United Nations facilities and institutions, buildings, were even targeted by Israel. Sometimes displaced families, for instance, whose building or compounds were destroyed by missile attacks, were displaced and they moved to live in schools run by the United Nations. But then Israel would come and bomb these schools, and Israel would go away with it. An investigation would be opened or launched. They would say it was a mistake and we apologize, and that's it. It would not go further. Or they would claim that, Hamas is using these schools to launch rockets, and that's why we've targeted them. Hamas is using humans or civilians as a shield, as a human shield. But then Hamas did not exist in 1948 when Israel confiscated the land. Hamas did not exist in 67 when you occupied the Gaza Strip. Hamas did not have rockets until 10 years ago. But then Israel has systematically been doing this. Hamas does not exist in Jerusalem, for instance. Hamas has no existence in Sheikh Jarrah, and your settlers are still taking more houses and more lands in the West Bank. Hamas only operates in the Gaza Strip. Hamas has zero military presence in the West Bank and has no presence in Jerusalem. Does this mean that Israel or the settlers are not taking more land or are not treating Palestinians badly? Are they very kind to Palestinians in Jerusalem because Hamas does not exist there? I'm not defending Hamas. Ideologically far from even adopting a Hamas ideology, and I have huge differences. But we're talking here about justifications. Israel uses whatever justification or excuses to justify its brutal acts.
I was wondering about the situation in schools and the university, because you mentioned that you grew up, you've been to refugee school, sort of.
Yeah.
And then what about the Palestinian who would like to go to university? They got world-class university in Jerusalem, but how about the school system? How about the higher education system for Palestinian?
Palestinian people are considered highly educated because they always perceive education as the only hope for them to move forward. Education among female is about 98%. So 98% of women or female go to university education in both Gaza and the West Bank. Meanwhile, it's 95% amongst male. A good number of local universities, but also families do invest even sending their sons and daughters abroad to receive education. Like many Palestinians go abroad to the US and the UK and Europe for higher education, etc. But does this mean that Palestinians do not face challenges receiving education? No. In many situations, universities and schools are targets by the Israeli military institutions. Like in 2014, the Islamic University of Gaza Strip was a direct target by the Israeli. Basically, many of its buildings were destroyed by Israel. They were saying that the university was undertaking research to improve weapon manufacture. So again, there was this excuse ready to basically justify destroying academic institutions. In the West Bank, for instance, students always face challenges accessing their schools because basically you would see settlers either stopping them, barriers put in the streets to ban them from reaching to their schools, or the fence, that separation wall that would make access to school more difficult. I'll give you a personal story about myself. When I finished my BA degree back in 2001, and in 2002 I received a scholarship to study MBA in British Columbia. Israel was, as I said, Israel controls the borders with Egypt. We don't have airports, neither in the West Bank nor in Gaza. If we want to travel, we have to go to either Jordan or to Egypt in order to take a flight from there. So basically, I was going to Egypt to take my flight and go to Canada. So I was stopped at the border, and the security officer asked me where I was going. I told him I was going to Canada to pursue my master's degree. Guess what happened? I was imprisoned for 2 months.
For what particular reason?
Do they have to give you a reason?
So there's no reason at all whatsoever?
No. Suspicions. And then after 2 months, once you lose your scholarship, they really freed me, released me. The security officer was like, okay, if you want to go. I was like, well, it's too late now. I don't want to go. They don't want an educated population. They don't want a population that knows its rights. They don't want a population that can legally challenge them. They don't want a population that has strong media to basically show the bare truth of what's happening. So they try to always not only confiscating land, but also to weaken you so that you don't defend yourself.
So I guess one last question. Well, by the way, thank you so much, Dr. Tannira, for this. So last question, in your point of view, what is going to happen next?
No, nothing is going to happen. Nothing is going to happen. Mediators are going to get into the middle. Once Israel has finished targeting, has basically run out. Israel is facing internal pressure at the moment, and the political institution within Israel is highly embarrassed, but they can't stop. They want to always maintain this upper hand in the conflict. They can't say, okay, we are defeated. Hamas managed to kind of give us a punch in the face. So basically what Israel is trying to do now is causing so much pain to the Palestinians. So they would basically surrender and raise their hands. And Palestinians are in so much pain. If you want to compare casualties amongst Palestinians as compared to Israelis, until this morning, 126 people have died or were killed in 6 days. Israelis, 9. So basically it's less one. So we can't compare losses. But the political institution within Israel is highly embarrassed. They always try to maintain political stability within Israel. But then the situation happens. They want to basically continue confiscating land, but they don't want military confrontation like this one. So mediators are going to get into the middle. They're trying to convince Palestinian sides to stop firing rockets and for Israel to stop targeting civilians. In one way or another, it will stop. Like the war that happened in 2008 and 2012 and 2014. In 2014, more than 1,600 people were killed in 40 days. But then it stopped. The Egyptian mediator has, and the US and the European Union, convinced both sides to stop. But then, in terms of losses, as I said, a huge difference between both. It's going to stop. Things are going to improve, but then Israel will continue confiscating land. Because this is the strategic goal of Israel. It's to basically control entire Jerusalem. And for Gaza to live only, to eat, drink, and live a very poor life, and that's it.
ขอขอบคุณทุกท่านนะคะที่มารับฟังกันในวันนี้นะคะแล้วก็หวังว่าโอกาสหน้าถ้ามีเหตุการณ์ใดเกิดขึ้นซึ่งเราหวังว่าจะไม่มีนะคะก็อาจจะเชิญดร. Tannira มาอีกครั้งนะคะหรือว่าจะเป็นเหตุการณ์อื่นก็สำหรับวันนี้ก็ต้องขอบคุณมากนะคะแล้วก็สวัสดีทุกท่านนะคะ Thank you so much Dr. Tannira and I'll be seeing you later.
Pleasure. Thank you. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.